The film begins in a distant future where the United States has fallen under the control of an all-powerful media empire known as the network. Society has fractured. Most people struggle to survive, unable to afford even the most basic medical care. To keep the population distracted and under control, the network fills the airwaves with brutal, high-stakes game shows built on violence and desperation. The most famous of them all is The Running Man, a deadly competition where participants must evade trained hunters for 30 days. The reward for surviving is a staggering $1 billion. Yet despite the promise, not a single contestant has ever lasted until the end. Amid this bleak world, we meet Ben, a man whose life has recently unraveled. He lost his job after supporting the formation of a labor union, an act that led to him being blacklisted across every industry. Now, no one will hire him. At home, the situation is just as dire. His young daughter, Kathy, is seriously ill, and the family cannot afford the medication she desperately needs. His wife, Sheila, returns home late one night and reveals she has been working extra hours at a bar to bring in more money. Ben is uneasy about this. He's noticed questionable individuals frequenting the place, but he hides his concern and tries to reassure her. Determined to change their situation, Ben makes a bold decision. He tells Sheila he plans to enter a game show and win the prize money. She immediately pushes back, knowing full well how dangerous these shows are. Contestants are often injured or killed. Ben insists he'll be careful and claims he'll choose the safest option available. Though unconvinced, Sheila has little choice but to listen. Leaving behind his struggling neighborhood, Ben makes his way to the heavily secured entrance of an affluent district. When questioned by guards, he claims he's there for a network program, which grants him access. Inside, he finds a long queue of desperate individuals, all hoping for a chance to change their lives. As the line moves forward, an elderly man suddenly becomes gravely ill. Despite barely being able to stand, the man refuses to give up his place, clearly driven by desperation. When he collapses, Ben steps in to catch him and calls for assistance. Instead of helping, the guards accuse Ben of interfering and breaking protocol. Without hesitation, they drag him away, beat him, and throw him out of the line. Later, he discovers that a disciplinary warning has been added to his record for disobedience. Furious and humiliated, Ben lashes out, smashing the screen in front of him in anger. The outburst doesn't go unnoticed. He's quickly restrained, fitted with a tracking bracelet, and directed toward Elevator 6. Inside, he meets two other participants, Tim and Jenny, who attempt to strike up a conversation and ease the tension. Soon after, all selected candidates are issued uniforms and subjected to a series of grueling physical trials. The challenges are intense and often bizarre, including endurance runs that push contestants to their limits. During these tests, Ben steps in to help Tim, showing a glimpse of his character. However, the environment remains hostile. At one point, a guard tries to discipline Ben during a break, but Ben refuses to submit. He stands his ground and fights back, intimidating the guard enough to make him back off. The evaluations continue, shifting from physical to psychological. When questioned, Ben doesn't hold back. His answers are blunt, aggressive, and completely unfiltered. This earns him a label from the psychologist as the most volatile and defiant participant in the group. Those who make it through the final selection round are given brightly colored jumpsuits. Ben and Jenny are assigned red suits, each marked with a target symbol on the back, a clear indication that they've been chosen as official contestants for The Running Man. Soon after, Ben is brought face-to-face with Dan, the producer of the show. Hoping to avoid the deadly competition, Ben asks to be transferred to a different program. Dan dismisses the idea and instead offers him additional money to stay, explaining that no other show offers rewards even close to this level. He also reminds Ben that since he's blacklisted, he has no real future outside of this opportunity. The more days he survives, the more money he earns. Faced with no alternatives and thinking of his family, Ben reluctantly signs the contract. Following this, Ben meets with a representative from an organization called the Family Alliance. Under the agreement, the network promises to keep his family safe while he participates. Sheila and Kathy are relocated to a secure location and given new identities. Though Ben desperately wants to see them before everything begins, he's only granted a single phone call. When he speaks to Sheila, he tells her about his decision and reassures her, promising that he'll come back alive. Later that night, Ben is forcibly taken to a luxurious room. An agent delivers an envelope sent by Sheila. Inside, he finds a photograph of his family along with a small stocking from Kathy, meant to bring him luck. The gesture hits him deeply, reminding him exactly what he's fighting for. The next morning, Ben is fitted with a running band, a device that tracks how much time he has left and how much money he's earned. With everything in place, the show officially begins. He's brought onto a massive stage where the charismatic host, Bobby, introduces him to a roaring audience. But instead of telling the truth, Bobby fabricates a story. He claims that Ben once worked in national defense and was arrested for leaking classified information. To support the lie, the network plays a convincingly edited video generated using artificial intelligence. Ben desperately tries to tell the audience it's all false, but no one listens. Bobby continues the show as if nothing is wrong. To the viewers at home, the running man is presented as a form of justice, punishment for dangerous criminals. What they don't realize is that the contestants are ordinary people, pushed into this deadly game out of desperation. To make things even more intense, the network encourages viewers to participate by offering cash rewards to anyone who reports a contestant's location. When asked for his final statement before the game begins, Ben doesn't hold back. He lashes out at both the host and the cheering crowd, calling out their hypocrisy. He vows not only to survive, but to tear down the entire corrupt system behind the show. With all contestants introduced, Bobby lays out the rules. Each participant is given a small amount of starting cash and a 12-hour head start before the hunters are released. For the first 12 hours, the contestants are given a brief window of freedom, a chance to disappear before the real hunt begins. During this period, they can move anywhere without being pursued. But once that time expires, 5 elite hunters will be unleashed to track them down. There's another condition as well. Each contestant must record at least 10 minutes of footage every single day and submit it before midnight. Miss the deadline and the money stops, but the hunt doesn't. Soon after, the 3 contestants are separated and transported in individual elevators to a dimly lit room. There, Ben is handed a camera, a small amount of cash, and a set of everyday clothes. He wastes no time changing and slipping out of the building. The moment he steps outside, he flags down a taxi and jumps in. The driver quickly recognizes him. Excited at first, he asks for a photo, but when Ben refuses, the driver's attitude shifts instantly. His tone turns threatening. He warns Ben that he could easily report his location unless he's treated properly. Not wanting to escalate things, Ben pays the fare and gets out as soon as he can. From there, he sprints through the city, weaving between streets until he finally arrives at the apartment of his old friend, Molly. Molly operates in the shadows, dealing in illegal goods and forged items. Ben urgently asks for fake identification and a weapon, but instead of helping right away, Molly explodes in anger. He can't believe Ben would show up while still being part of the game. He warns him that people are already searching, and just being there puts his entire operation at risk. The argument intensifies until Ben brings up his daughter's condition. Hearing about Kathy's illness softens Molly just enough. Reluctantly, he agrees to help. He disguises Ben, crafts matching fake IDs, and even packs his belongings into a suitcase to make him look like a legitimate traveler. Before sending him off, Molly gives him a blunt warning. Stay away from poor neighborhoods. Desperate people will turn him in for the reward money without hesitation. Crowded, busier areas are his safest bet. He also admits that if Ben had come earlier, he would have given him a job. But now there's only one way out: win the game. The next morning, Ben heads to the train station. His face is everywhere, posters plastered across walls, turning him into a walking target. Keeping his composure, he buys a ticket to New York and boards the train. Just as it departs, his bracelet signals that the hunt has officially begun. During the journey, a young boy approaches him, trying to make conversation. Ben, on edge, snaps and scares the child away, but the boy returns moments later, awkwardly mentioning that he's growing a mustache, an odd, almost innocent moment that contrasts sharply with Ben's paranoia. Once in New York, Ben checks into a high-end hotel. At the reception desk, the clerk notices something off. The ID photo shows a man with a mustache, while Ben is clean-shaven. He brushes it off and heads to his room. Inside, he removes the disguise entirely, reverting to his original appearance. To buy himself time, he stages a clever trick, covering parts of the room and recording footage that makes it appear as if he's peacefully asleep. That evening, he drops the tape into the designated collection box. When midnight hits, his bracelet confirms he's earned his first day's payout. Elsewhere, things take a darker turn. Molly is captured by the hunters. Under brutal torture, she's forced to reveal the identity connected to the fake documents she created for Ben. The following day, the hunters storm Ben's hotel room and open fire, riddling the bed with bullets, only for Ben to suddenly jolt awake. It was all a nightmare, a chilling reminder of what's waiting for him. Moments later, the television broadcasts live footage of Tim. He's casually flirting with a store clerk, seemingly relaxed despite the danger. But the moment he steps outside, the hunters locate him instantly. Without hesitation, they shoot him point-blank in the head, It's over in seconds. Shaken by what he's just seen, Ben decides he can't stay put. He rents another hotel room, planning to remain under the radar for a few days. He carefully packs his belongings into a plain bag and tosses it out of the window into a dumpster below. Then, acting as if nothing is wrong, he calmly walks out of the hotel. Outside, he retrieves the bag and boards a bus heading to Boston. In Boston, he changes his appearance again, this time dressing in worn, inexpensive clothing. He buys a hostel key from a struggling man and quietly makes his way inside. Taking the elevator, he doesn't notice the out-of-service sign posted nearby. Halfway up, the elevator jerks to a stop between floors. With no other choice, Ben forces his way out and climbs upward, eventually reaching the third floor where his room is located. Inside, he discovers a small box hidden in the closet. It contains chewing gum, cigarettes, and surprisingly, a grenade. He records his required daily footage, but when it's time to submit the tape, he notices too many people gathered around the drop-off box. It's too risky. He retreats to the shared bathroom, preparing to shower while thinking through his next move. That's when something clicks. One of the men he saw outside looked familiar. Too familiar. A hunter. And if one is here, more won't be far behind. Suddenly, the bathroom door creaks open. Ben instantly hides. Moments later, the hunters arrive on the third floor and begin checking rooms one by one. Once they move on, Ben slips out cautiously. He approaches the window to assess his escape route, but it's sealed shut. With his bag gone, he's left with limited options. Thinking fast, he rips an iron rod from the wall and smashes the glass. Then, using the chewing gum, he sticks broken shards onto the rod, turning it into a makeshift weapon. Stepping into the hallway, he uses a mirror to track the hunter's movements without exposing himself. Just as they prepare to enter his room, Ben bolts for the stairwell. As he runs, he shouts loudly, claiming the contestant from the show has fled to the second floor, urging them to chase after him. The distraction works. While the hunters scramble to react, Ben races upward, pushing himself until he finally bursts onto the rooftop. From the rooftop, Ben quickly grabbed hold of the cable attached to a flickering sign and began lowering himself down the side of the building. Swinging carefully, he maneuvered back toward his floor, smashed through the window of his room, and pulled himself inside. The crash of glass didn't go unnoticed. The hunters immediately turned back in his direction. With no time to waste, Ben threw on his clothes and scooped up his belongings. Gunshots tore through the door as he made a split-second decision. He leapt back out of the window and caught another hanging cable. The massive sign above him tilted under his weight, creaking dangerously. Looking down, he spotted one of the hunters waiting below, clearly expecting him to fall. Cornered and out of options, Ben acted fast. He swung toward a nearby window, smashed through it, and tumbled into another room. Above him, a surveillance drone hovered, broadcasting his every move live. He dashed into the hallway as bullets chased him from behind. Reaching the elevator, he grabbed the drone midair and slammed it into the control panel. Sparks flew, the live broadcast cut instantly, and the elevator system rebooted. As he reached the lobby, a hunter lunged straight at him. Ben reacted instinctively, pulling out a grenade and tossing it upward through a hole in the ceiling. The explosion that followed was devastating. The blast sent shockwaves through the structure, and moments later, the elevator collapsed, crashing down into the basement. Now trapped below with only a small matchbox, Ben tore pages from a magazine and lit them to see in the darkness. As he moved forward, he accidentally ignited a rope, causing flames to spread rapidly. Smoke filled the air as the hunters closed in from the corridor. Thinking quickly, Ben dragged nearby furniture to block the entrance, buying himself a few seconds. With no clear escape, he crawled into a filthy pigsty, following the path of scurrying rats through a narrow passage. The hunters fired blindly into the darkness. One stray bullet struck a gas pipe, and within seconds, a massive explosion ripped through the basement. Flames surged into the tunnels, forcing Ben to push deeper into the cramped, suffocating space. Moments later, the entire building erupted in a catastrophic blast. When Ben finally emerged onto the street, battered but alive, he was confronted by a young boy named Stacy. Instinctively, Ben threatened him, warning him not to say a word about what he'd seen. But Stacy remained calm, insisting he only wanted to help. Checking his bracelet, Ben learned that the explosion had claimed many lives. The system also informed him that he had earned a significant amount of money from the chaos. Not long after, Stacy returned, this time with his older brother, Brad. Brad cautiously brought Ben to his home, offering him food and a place to rest. It soon became clear that Brad was struggling too. He had a sick child of his own. Despite his situation, he refused to accept any money from Ben. He despised the network and wanted no part of anything tied to it. Brad then revealed a hidden room inside the house. Within it, he had been secretly recording and analyzing episodes of The Running Man. Using stolen footage and careful observation, he tracked the fate of contestants. From his research, one thing was clear. Once a player's identity became public, survival became nearly impossible. Staying hidden was everything. He urged Ben to remain with him and lay low until the final day. The next morning, Ben saw firsthand how bad things had become. Violence was spreading, people were suffering, and the government was doing nothing. Instead, they were actively covering it up. Furious, Ben recorded a message, directly accusing those in power of ignoring the suffering of innocent people, even children. Later, during the broadcast, Bobby appeared on screen alongside a group of children. He claimed they were orphans of those killed in the explosion. Then he played Ben's message, but heavily edited. The footage was twisted to make it seem like Ben was mocking the children rather than defending them. Ben tried to explain the truth, but the damage was done. Brad's mother, believing the broadcast, lashed out in anger and forced Ben out of the house without hearing his side. Despite this, Brad and Stacy didn't abandon him. They hid Ben in the trunk of a car and set off to get him out safely. For a moment, everything seemed under control, until gunfire shattered the silence. Two bikers were chasing them, firing directly at the trunk. Inside, Ben kicked it open and hurled a tool straight at one of the attackers, striking him in the face and knocking him off his bike. The second biker kept firing. Ben ducked back inside as Brad suddenly slammed the brakes. The pursuing bikes couldn't react in time. They crashed violently into the car. Seizing the moment, Brad hit the accelerator and drove forward, crushing both attackers before speeding away. Eventually, Brad dropped Ben off outside the city. Before leaving, he handed him a gun and gave him the address of a trusted contact, someone named Elton. After a short train ride, Ben once again checked into a hotel, keeping a low profile. While there, he watched his latest tape being aired on television. As expected, the network had twisted it. That's why he had deliberately recorded something harmless, himself quietly reading a book, leaving them with nothing to manipulate. Meanwhile, Bobby aired Jenny's footage as well. It showed her enjoying herself at a nightclub, completely unaware of the danger closing in. Later, Ben disguised himself again and headed out to submit his daily tape. As he approached the drop-off box, a mailman nearby began watching him closely. Pretending to make casual conversation, the man secretly recorded Ben. Sensing something was off, Ben suddenly attacked him. He shoved the tape into the box and took off running. The mailman gave chase, following him onto the railway tracks. Ben sprinted through the trees, jumped a fence, and leapt onto a moving train just as a gunshot rang out behind him. The bullet missed. He had escaped again. Some time later, Ben adopted yet another disguise, this time posing as a disabled man. Limping through a crowd gathered around a street performance, he blended in seamlessly. Elsewhere, Jenny's luck finally ran out. She was captured inside a casino. In a desperate attempt to escape, she tried to flee in a car, but two men intercepted her and set the vehicle on fire, killing her instantly. Eventually, Ben reached Elton's place. Elton lived with his mother and warned Ben in advance she wasn't mentally stable. He advised him to ignore anything unusual she might say or do. Elton then led Ben to a concealed room. Inside, he had been secretly printing and distributing pamphlets against the network. He revealed that his father had once been a police officer. Elton revealed that his father had once tried to stand against the system and paid for it with his life. Fellow officers silenced him when he refused to stay quiet. Since that day, Elton had turned against everything the network stood for, dedicating himself to resisting it in secret. He explained that the entire country was under constant surveillance. Streetlights weren't just for illumination. They were equipped with scanners capable of detecting even the smallest traces of DNA. Moving freely above ground was nearly impossible. If Ben wanted to survive, he would have to disappear completely. Elton then told him about a hidden bunker his father had built during the Cold War. It was designed to remain undetected, the perfect place to stay off the grid until the final day. He urged Ben to use it as shelter. In return, Elton asked for one thing. If Ben survived and gained the attention of the public, he should help spread the rebel message and expose the truth behind the network. That night, Ben stayed in the concealed room and recorded his required footage. But the next morning, everything fell apart. As he prepared to deliver the tape, Elton's mother caught a glimpse of the recording. She instantly recognized Ben. At first, Elton tried to calm her down, stopping her from taking any action. But her grief and anger ran deeper than reason. She saw this as an opportunity to avenge her husband. Ignoring Elton's pleas, she contacted the authorities herself. Within minutes, the house was surrounded. Gunfire tore through the walls as officers stormed in. Elton's mother attempted to reveal their hiding place, shouting out their location. With no other choice, Elton locked her inside a room and activated the defenses his father had built years ago. As the police advanced, Elton triggered the first trap, spilling water across exposed electrical wiring on the floor. The moment officers stepped in, powerful currents surged through them, knocking several to the ground. Without hesitation, Elton and Ben smashed through a hidden wall and escaped into another section of the house. The pursuit continued. Another trap released a flammable chemical into the air. Seconds later, it ignited, engulfing the area in flames and forcing the officers back. On the staircase, yet another mechanism activated. The wooden steps gave way, sending several officers crashing down. Elton led Ben into the bathroom, where they revealed a hidden escape route. Sliding down a concealed pole inside the shower, they landed in a lower room. From there, Elton opened a trapdoor in the floor, and both of them descended into an underground tunnel. But they weren't alone. A hunter was already waiting in the shadows. Without warning, he lunged forward and stabbed Elton before turning on Ben. A brutal struggle followed. Ben's hand was slashed, but he fought back fiercely, eventually gaining the upper hand. Injured but still standing, Elton grabbed a knife and drove it into the hunter's leg, forcing him down. As the wounded hunter lay there, his communication device buzzed to life. Dan was on the line. He demanded to speak with Ben directly. Ben, breathing heavily, asked why the network didn't simply fabricate everything using their advanced technology. Why risk real lives at all? Dan's response was cold and calculated. They had considered it, he said, but artificial creations lacked authenticity. Real people, real fear, real emotion. That's what kept the audience hooked. Then he gave an order. He told Ben to kill the hunter on camera so the drone could capture the moment and boost ratings. Ben refused. Instead, he raised his weapon and fired at the drone hovering above, destroying it instantly. Cutting off their surveillance, he and Elton forced their way out through a nearby vehicle and escaped. They ran toward the forest, desperate to put distance between themselves and the chaos. But the network wasn't done yet. A helicopter appeared overhead, tracking their movement. Realizing he wouldn't make it, Elton told Ben to keep going to reach the bunker alone. Before Ben could respond, a sniper shot rang out. Elton dropped instantly, a bullet through his head. The loss hit hard, but there was no time to stop. Hunters quickly surrounded Ben, weapons trained on him. They had strict instructions not to kill him. The network wanted him alive, for a public execution that would captivate viewers. Nearby, a vehicle sat rigged with explosives. Ben made a daring move. He jumped into the driver's seat and sped toward a bridge. At the last second, he leapt out, sending the vehicle crashing straight into one of the hunters. The explosion that followed lit up the night. Without hesitation, Ben dove off the bridge into the river below. Moments later, his bracelet updated, another bonus added to his total for eliminating a hunter. He pressed on, moving through small villages and open fields, heading toward the bunker Elton had mentioned. But when he finally arrived, he found nothing. The bunker was gone. In its place, construction had begun for a new city. The last safe refuge he had hoped for no longer existed. With nowhere else to turn, Ben took shelter in an abandoned house for the night. Exhausted and alone, he drifted into thoughts of his family. The image of them gave him the strength to keep going. By morning, the police had tracked him down again. When they entered the house, they discovered his latest tape, along with instructions to mail it out. Ben didn't wait to be cornered. He smashed the window of the nearest car and climbed inside, only to find a young woman already sitting behind the wheel. Her name was Amelia. Startled and terrified, she tried to react, but Ben quickly took control, threatening her and demanding she drive. As they sped off, police vehicles and drones swarmed behind them, turning the streets into a high-speed chase. They narrowly avoided multiple collisions. Then, in a risky move, Amelia suddenly swerved onto the opposite side of the road, catching their pursuers off guard and buying them precious time. During the drive, Amelia lashed out at Ben, calling him a monster for everything she had seen on television. In response, Ben showed her a photograph of his family. He explained how the network manipulated footage, twisting reality to control public perception. Before she could respond, the car's AI system was suddenly hijacked. The vehicle jerked violently, swerving out of control. At the same time, two hunters arrived in a truck, attempting to intercept them. But instead of targeting Ben, a drone opened fire on the truck, destroying it in a fiery explosion. It became clear Dan wanted Ben alive at all costs. Meanwhile, on live television, a fabricated clip aired showing Amelia screaming in fear, as if she were being held hostage. Watching this unfold, Amelia finally began to understand the truth. As they continued driving, something unexpected happened. People along the roadside began cheering for them. For the first time, the public was starting to question the narrative. Eventually, they reached a blockade. The lead hunter stood waiting, surrounded by armed units and multiple drones capturing every angle. The tension was overwhelming. Ben stepped out, pretending to hold an explosive. He shouted that he was willing to kill innocent civilians on live television if his demands weren't met. Then he made his terms clear. He wanted a plane and 2 parachutes. After a brief moment of hesitation, the hunters received their orders. They were told to comply. At the airport, just before boarding, Ben turned to Amelia and told her she didn't have to come any further. She was free to walk away. But Amelia refused. After everything she had witnessed, she couldn't simply return to her old life and pretend none of it was real. Once they were on the plane, Ben demanded that the lead hunter remove his mask. The man hesitated, clearly unwilling to reveal himself. But when Dan's voice came through, ordering him to comply, he had no choice. The cameras zoomed in as the mask came off, exposing his identity. His name was Ivan. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, Ben quickly realized something wasn't right. The pilots weren't just crew, they were part of the system too, planted there to ensure he never made it out alive. Ben immediately warned them that unless they redirected the plane to Canada, he would detonate the aircraft. Tension filled the cabin as the plane lifted into the sky. During the flight, Ben confronted Ivan face to face. He accused him of murdering innocent people, questioning whether he felt any guilt for what he had done. The confrontation escalated quickly, both men on edge, ready to snap at any moment. Then Amelia intervened. She suddenly acted as if she had lost control, panicking about the supposed bomb on board. At that exact moment, Dan appeared on a screen inside the plane. Calm and confident, he revealed that the aircraft had already been scanned. There was no bomb. Ivan immediately raised his weapon, aiming to end it right there. But before he could pull the trigger, the pilots turned their guns on him instead. Dan's voice cut through again, scolding Ivan. Ben wasn't supposed to die yet. His death needed to be dramatic, something that would captivate the audience. Moments later, Dan contacted Ben privately. His tone shifted, now offering a deal. If Ben killed Ivan and the pilots, he could take their place. He would become a hunter, earning millions, living comfortably, never having to run again. Ben didn't even consider it. He refused outright. Dan's response was ruthless. He played a video, one that appeared to show Sheila and Kathy being killed by hunters. The sight shattered. Ben rage consumed him as he screamed and smashed the screen in front of him. Amelia quickly switched to another feed. Bobby was live on television, showing clips of Ben's family. He claimed that the hunters, furious over Ben's actions, had broken protocol and killed them. The audience watched in shock, and for the first time, sympathy began to shift toward Ben inside the cockpit. Everything spiraled. One of the pilots, sensing the change in public opinion, raised his weapon, but Ben reacted faster. He shot him first and used the falling body as cover. The second pilot opened fire wildly, and chaos erupted in the cramped space. A brutal struggle unfolded. Ben fought with everything he had, pushing through the pain, taking down anyone who stood in his way. The plane began to shake violently, losing stability as control slipped. In the middle of the chaos, Ben grabbed his weapon and fired, killing the hunter. Gradually, partial control of the aircraft was restored, and it steadied for now. But the fight wasn't over. Later, Ben discovered Ivan hiding inside a maintenance hatch. Without warning, Ivan lunged at him. Another vicious fight broke out. Fueled by anger, Ben slammed Ivan's head into a mirror, shattering it. Ivan retaliated instantly. Grabbing a shard of broken glass, he drove it into Ben's stomach. As Ben staggered, Ivan revealed the truth about himself. He had once been a contestant too. He had survived for 29 days. That was when the network offered him a choice: die or become one of them. He chose survival. Ivan explained that the network controlled everything. Families could be threatened, tortured, even killed if necessary. The footage Ben had seen might not have been real at all. He asked him, did he still not understand how the system truly worked? Raising his weapon, Ivan prepared to finish him. But suddenly, the plane lurched violently. The force slammed both of them toward a shattered window as the aircraft began a steep descent. Ivan struggled to regain his aim, but in the chaos, Ben noticed something: the parachute. Ivan had taken it. Thinking fast, Ben pulled the release. The parachute deployed, but it became tangled in the broken window frame. Seizing the moment, Ben grabbed the advantage and struck. With one final, decisive move, he stabbed Ivan, ending the fight. Breathing heavily, Ben turned to Amelia. He handed her a bag filled with Elton's rebel pamphlets, the message that needed to spread. Without hesitation, he opened the plane door and pushed her out, deploying the parachute and sending her safely into the sky below. A drone immediately began chasing her. As it followed, Amelia shouted in defiance and scattered the pamphlets into the air, letting them drift across the city. Back on the broadcast, Dan addressed the audience, claiming that Ben had now become a hunter himself, twisting the narrative once again. But before the signal could be cut, Ben spoke directly to the viewers. He exposed everything. He told them the network controlled their reality, manipulated their perceptions, and fed them lies. He urged people to stop watching, to stop believing, and to rise against those in power. The transmission was cut instantly. Within moments, Dan's team edited the footage, rewriting the story yet again. This time, it was shown as if Ben had deliberately crashed the plane into a crowded area. On screen, the aircraft appeared to explode midair near a station, but not everyone believed it. Sometime later, Brad carefully analyzed the broadcast. He noticed inconsistencies, details that didn't add up. The story didn't make sense, and as more people began questioning what they saw, public anger grew. Eventually, the plane's black box was recovered. The original footage leaked online. The truth spread rapidly. Combined with Ben's message, amplified through Elton's pamphlets, people began to see the reality for what it was. Support for a rebellion surged. The network's control began to crack. Brad also pointed out something critical. The plane didn't have an auto-ejection system, which meant Ben might still be alive. Elsewhere, Sheila and Kathy were seen at a market, alive and well. They appeared safe, living comfortably, likely supported by the money Ben had earned. As they stepped outside, they froze. Standing there, waiting for them, was Ben. At the network studio, chaos erupted. Host Bobby, terrified by the growing outrage, abandoned his position and fled. When Dan appeared before the crowd, the tension snapped. Explosives were thrown, and the building was stormed by rebels. Destruction spread through the station. Dan tried to escape the madness, but as he fled, he became tangled in a cable and fell. Flames surrounded him. Then, through the fire, Ben emerged. Without hesitation, he raised his weapon and shot Dan, ending it once and for all. Standing amid the chaos, Ben made one final vow: to bring down the entire corrupt system. What if survival wasn't just a fight, but a broadcast? What if your desperation, your pain, your struggle to stay alive wasn't hidden from the world, but sold to it? That's the terrifying foundation of The Running Man 2025. And what makes that idea land so effectively isn't just the shock of it, it's how quickly the film makes it feel normalized. It doesn't present this world as some distant, unimaginable future. It presents it as a system people have already accepted, adapted to, and even found comfort in. That's what gives the premise its edge. It's not just horrifying because it exists, it's horrifying because it works. This isn't just another dystopian setting thrown together for action spectacle. It's a world that feels disturbingly close, almost like an exaggerated reflection of where we're already heading. And the film understands that fear doesn't come from scale, it comes from recognition. The systems in place don't feel alien, they feel like extensions, amplifications of things we already see. Curated narratives, algorithm-driven attention, the blurring line between information and entertainment. It takes those ideas and pushes them just far enough to make you uncomfortable, but not so far that you can dismiss them. In this version, society is no longer just influenced by media, it is controlled by it. A single, dominant broadcasting system dictates reality, and what's interesting is how the film frames that control, not as something imposed, but something maintained. People participate in it, they consume it, they rely on it. Information isn't just delivered, it's engineered. Truth isn't discovered, it's manufactured. And the film subtly suggests that the most dangerous part of that isn't deception, it's convenience. When reality becomes easier to accept than to question, control becomes invisible. And at the center of it all is entertainment, but not the kind you casually scroll through. This is entertainment built on human suffering. And the film leans into that discomfort without ever fully pausing to explain it, which actually makes it more effective. It doesn't ask you to justify it, it just shows you how it exists. The biggest show in the world. A brutal, live-streamed hunt. Contestants, real people, are released into the wild, tracked, hunted, and eliminated for the world to watch. And what makes that concept hit harder is the way it's presented as routine, not controversial. Not debated, just popular. Survive 30 days and you win everything. Money, safety, a second chance at life. But even that reward structure carries weight, because it turns survival into a transaction. Your life becomes something you can gamble with. Your suffering becomes currency. And failure doesn't just mean death, it means erasure, repackaged as content for others to consume. Fail, you become content. And that idea lingers longer than any action sequence, because it reframes the entire concept of value in this world. You're not important because you exist, you're important because you can be watched. And that's what makes this world so unsettling, because it doesn't feel impossible. It feels familiar. The film builds this environment through layers, and it does it with a kind of quiet precision. It doesn't rely on exposition dumps or heavy explanations. Instead, it lets the world reveal itself through behavior, through design, through the way people interact with the system. A broken economic system where ordinary people are pushed into impossible choices, and those choices don't feel dramatic, they feel inevitable, like the only logical outcome of a system that has removed every other option. A society divided so sharply between the powerful and the powerless that survival itself becomes a luxury, and the film reinforces that divide not just through wealth but through visibility: who gets seen, who gets heard, who gets edited into something favorable, and who gets reduced to a target. A media machine so dominant, it doesn't just report reality, it replaces it. And once that replacement becomes accepted truth, resistance doesn't just become difficult, it becomes irrelevant. Even the smallest details reinforce this control. Cameras aren't just present, they're everywhere. But more importantly, they're normalized. No one reacts to them anymore. They've become part of the environment, like air or noise. Floating, watching, broadcasting every movement. And that constant presence creates a kind of psychological pressure that never lets up. There's no private moment, no space to breathe without being observed. And that absence of privacy becomes its own form of tension. The audience isn't passive either, they're part of the system. And that's where the film adds another layer of discomfort, because it removes the distance between viewer and participant. They can track you, report you, help end you, and in doing that, the film turns spectatorship into complicity. Watching isn't neutral anymore, it's active. Every view, every interaction, every engagement contributes to the machine. This isn't just a game, it's a nationwide spectacle of surveillance and participation, a system that feeds on attention and sustains itself through involvement. And at the center of this machine is Ben Richards, not a hero. Not a chosen one, just a man pushed to the edge. And that distinction matters, because the film doesn't frame him as exceptional, it frames him as relatable, a father, a provider, someone who runs out of options. And that grounding is what anchors the entire story, because no matter how large the world becomes, the emotional core stays small, personal, immediate. And that's where the film makes its smartest move. Because this world isn't built around fantasy, it's built around pressure. Pressure from poverty, pressure from authority, pressure from a system designed to break you, then profit from the pieces. And that pressure isn't constant in a loud, aggressive way, it's constant in a suffocating way. It's always there, shaping decisions, limiting choices, narrowing paths until there's only one direction left to go. The show isn't just about survival, it's about how far someone will go when the system leaves them no choice. And more importantly, it asks whether that choice was ever really theirs to begin with. Because when every alternative has been stripped away, survival stops being a decision and starts becoming a reaction. And the brilliance of this premise is how it blends scale with intimacy. On one hand, you have this massive, oppressive world: corporations, broadcasts, crowds, control, systems so large they feel impossible to challenge. On the other, you have one man running, breathing, hiding, trying to stay alive one moment at a time. And the film constantly shifts between those two perspectives, reminding you that no matter how big the system is, it ultimately manifests in very small, very human moments. That contrast is what gives the story its weight, because no matter how big the system becomes, it all comes down to one question: can a single person outrun a world that wants them dead? And it's not just a physical question, it's psychological, emotional, existential, because running isn't just about distance, it's about endurance, about how long you can keep going when everything around you is designed to stop you. That's the core of The Running Man, not just action, not just spectacle, but survival in a world where reality itself has been turned into a game with rules you didn't choose and consequences you can't escape. Before you even press play on The Running Man 2025, there's one question you can't escape: what is this movie trying to be? And that question isn't just about genre, it's about identity. A remake, a reboot, a correction, or something entirely new, because this story doesn't come from nowhere. It carries two very different legacies, and the film is constantly negotiating between them, whether it realizes it or not. On one side, you have Stephen King's original novel, dark, angry, stripped down, a story driven by desperation, paranoia, and a system that feels brutally real. And what defined that version wasn't just its premise, it was its tone: relentless, unforgiving. It didn't pause to entertain, it pushed forward with a kind of grim inevitability. Every step felt heavier than the last. On the other, you have the 1987 film. And let's be honest, that version didn't just adapt the story, it transformed it. It took the core idea and reimagined it as something louder, more theatrical, more exaggerated. It was loud, it was over the top. It was colorful, ridiculous, violent, and packed with personality. And that personality wasn't accidental, it was intentional. It knew exactly how far it was pushing things, and it leaned into that excess without hesitation. It didn't care about subtlety, it cared about entertainment. and in doing so, it created something that wasn't necessarily faithful, but was undeniably memorable, because it understood that tone isn't just a stylistic choice, it's an identity. It tells the audience how to feel, how to engage, what to expect. Now fast forward to 2025. This new version steps in and makes a very clear decision. It wants to go back to the source. And you can feel that intention in almost every structural choice, in the way the story unfolds not as a contained event, but as a journey, in the way the world feels less like a stage and more like a system. You can feel it in the structure, in the tone, in the way the story unfolds like a constant journey, moving from place to place, encounter to encounter, and that movement creates a different kind of tension. It's not about waiting for something to happen, it's about never being able to stop. This isn't a contained arena anymore. It's a road movie disguised as a survival game, and that shift changes the rhythm entirely. It makes the experience feel more fragmented, but also more immediate, and in that sense, it is undeniably closer to what Stephen King originally wrote. The world feels harsher, more grounded, less theatrical. And that grounding comes with its own strengths. It makes the stakes feel more tangible, more personal, less performative. The focus shifts from spectacle to system, from entertainment to oppression, and that shift reframes the entire narrative. It asks you not just to watch, but to think about the structure behind what you're watching. And on paper, that sounds like the smarter approach. It sounds more mature, more relevant, more aligned with the kind of storytelling audiences expect today. But here's where things get complicated, because while this version may be more faithful, it's not necessarily more effective. The 1987 film understood something this one struggles with: commitment. It knew exactly what it was. It embraced its identity without hesitation. It didn't try to balance satire with seriousness. It leaned fully into its exaggerated world. And because of that, it became memorable. It didn't just tell a story. It created an experience that felt distinct, recognizable, and unapologetically itself. This new version, it's caught between two philosophies. And you can feel that tension in almost every scene. It wants the weight of the novel, but also the accessibility of a blockbuster. It wants to be serious, but still entertaining. It wants to be grounded, but still larger than life. And those goals aren't inherently incompatible, but they require precision, a clear understanding of where to draw the line, and instead of choosing one path, it walks both, which creates a strange effect. Because while the 2025 film feels more modern, more relevant, more aligned with today's world, it also feels less defined, less confident in its own identity. The 1987 version may have been ridiculous, but it had personality, it had a voice. This version has intention, but not always identity, and that difference matters more than it seems, and that's the trade-off. You get a film that respects the original material, that tries to bring out its darker themes, that repositions the story for a modern audience, but in doing so, it sacrifices some of the boldness that made the earlier version stand out. It smooths out the extremes, it avoids the edges, and in that process, it sometimes loses the very thing that makes a film stick with you. So when you compare the two, it's not about which one is better, it's about what you value more. A film that's faithful or a film that's unforgettable, because those two goals don't always align. Sometimes accuracy comes at the cost of impact, because The Running Man, 2025, may be closer to the truth of the story, but the 1987 version, that one made sure you never forgot it. Here's where The Running Man, 2025, either fascinates you or completely loses you, because this isn't just a story problem, it's a tone problem, and tone is everything. It's the invisible framework that holds everything together. Without it, even the strongest ideas start to drift. From the very beginning, the film tries to juggle multiple identities, and that ambition is clear. It wants to be a dark dystopian thriller. It wants to be a sharp satire about media and power. It wants to be a brutal action spectacle, and at the same time, it still flirts with humor. And not just occasional humor, tonal shifts that attempt to lighten moments that are otherwise heavy. That's a dangerous mix, because when it works, you get something layered, unpredictable, and powerful. A film that can move between tension and release without breaking immersion. But when it doesn't, you get a film that feels like it's constantly switching personalities, and that inconsistency becomes more noticeable the longer it goes on. One moment, the movie is deadly serious, showing a world where people are hunted for entertainment, where corporations control truth, where survival is stripped down to its most brutal form. The atmosphere tightens. The stakes feel immediate, you're pulled into the tension, and then suddenly it shifts. A joke, a quirky character, a burst of absurdity, and instead of blending naturally, it feels like a collision. Like two different versions of the film trying to exist in the same space without fully understanding each other. And that clash doesn't just affect the tone, it affects the immersion. It reminds you that you're watching something constructed, rather than experiencing something cohesive. The satire is there, no question. The film clearly wants to critique media manipulation, corporate greed, and the way violence is packaged as entertainment. And those ideas are strong. They're relevant. They have weight. But instead of cutting deep, it often just circles the idea. It gestures toward commentary without fully committing to it. You see what it's trying to say, but you don't always feel it. Because effective satire doesn't just present an idea, it pushes it. It sharpens it until it becomes impossible to ignore. Because the film doesn't fully commit to being sharp enough, the message sometimes feels softened, filtered, as if it's holding back just enough to remain accessible. And that hesitation becomes part of the tone problem, because satire needs confidence, it needs clarity, and when that clarity isn't fully there, the impact starts to fade. Then comes the violence, and this is where things get even more complicated. The movie leans into brutality, high-stakes chases, deadly encounters, a constant sense that anyone could die at any moment. And on a surface level, it delivers exactly what you expect from a concept like this. There's movement, there's impact, there's danger constantly surrounding the protagonist. But intensity in cinema isn't just about what's happening, it's about how it's felt. It's about the tension sitting underneath the action, the sense that every decision carries weight, that every moment could collapse into consequence. And that's where the film starts to lose its grip, because the violence, while visually aggressive, doesn't always carry emotional follow-through. It happens, it passes, and then the film moves on before that tension has time to fully settle in. There's a difference between showing brutality and making the audience sit with it. Here, the film often chooses momentum over impact, which weakens the sense of danger it's trying to build. You're seeing the threat, but you're not always internalizing it. And a big part of that comes back to instability in tone. When a film can't decide how seriously it wants to take its own world, it creates a disconnect between what's being shown and how it's being processed. The stakes might be life or death, but if the tone undercuts that seriousness, even briefly, it dilutes the experience. It creates hesitation in the audience. You're not fully leaning into the fear because the film itself isn't fully committing to it. And that's where the absence of camp becomes more significant than it first appears. The 1987 version didn't just include exaggeration, it relied on it. It turned its world into something heightened, almost theatrical, where the absurdity became part of the appeal. That exaggeration gave the violence a different kind of energy. It wasn't about realism, it was about spectacle with identity. It created a clear lens through which everything could be understood. This version steps away from that deliberately. It wants to feel grounded, restrained, more reflective of a believable future. And that's a valid direction. But when you strip away that heightened edge, you're left with something that needs to compensate through consistency and depth. And that's where the film struggles, because it doesn't replace that lost personality with something equally strong, it leaves a gap. So what you get is a tone that feels transitional rather than intentional. It's not leaning fully into realism, but it's also not embracing stylization. It exists in a space where it's constantly adjusting itself, trying to find balance but never quite settling into it. And that lack of stability affects everything, especially how the audience engages with the film's most intense moments. There are sequences where you can feel the film briefly align with itself. Moments where the tension is sustained, where the stakes feel immediate, where the tone, pacing, and action all move in sync. And in those moments, you see exactly what the film is capable of. You see a version of this story that feels sharp, controlled, and emotionally effective. But those moments are fleeting. They don't define the film, they interrupt it. Because instead of building toward a consistent rhythm, the film keeps resetting itself. It shifts gears without fully committing to the transition. And over time, that inconsistency becomes noticeable, not in a loud, distracting way, but in a subtle, cumulative way. You start to feel the unevenness even when you can't immediately pinpoint it, and that's the core issue. It doesn't choose, it keeps its options open, but in doing so, it weakens its own identity. Because tone isn't something you can partially commit to, it has to be definitive. It has to guide every decision, every scene, every shift in energy. Without that, even strong individual elements start to feel disconnected. So instead of a bold, clearly defined tone, you get something that feels fluid in the wrong way, not adaptable, uncertain, not layered, fragmented. And in a story like The Running Man, where the environment itself is chaotic, brutal, and overwhelming, that lack of tonal control doesn't just stand out, it amplifies everything that isn't working. Because if the film doesn't fully understand how it wants to feel, it can't fully guide how you experience it. And that gap between intention and execution becomes harder to ignore the longer the film goes on. Here's where The Running Man 2025 starts to lose its grip, not because of what it shows, but because of how it moves. Pacing is the heartbeat of a film like this. It's what transforms a sequence of events into a sustained experience. In a story built around pursuit, urgency isn't optional, it's essential. The structure itself demands forward momentum, a sense that time is always slipping away. But here, that momentum is inconsistent. It builds, then stalls, then rebuilds again without a clear progression. The opening takes its time establishing Ben Richards, his circumstances, his limitations, the pressures closing in around him. And while that foundation is important, the film lingers in that space just long enough for anticipation to start turning into impatience. You're waiting for the premise to activate, for the tension to escalate, and when it finally does, the impact is softened because the rhythm has already been slowed. That early imbalance carries into the rest of the film. Once the hunt begins, the expectation is that the pacing will tighten, that the narrative will lock into a relentless forward drive. Instead, it loosens. The middle portion becomes a series of encounters, each with its own tone, its own energy, its own purpose. And while that variety should create a sense of expansion, it often creates fragmentation instead. Because these sequences don't always build on each other in a meaningful way. They don't consistently raise the stakes or deepen the tension. They exist more as isolated moments than as parts of a larger progression. And that breaks the illusion of escalation. You're watching movement, but you're not always feeling direction. This episodic structure could have worked if there was a stronger through line connecting each segment, something that continuously reinforced the urgency of the situation. But without that, the journey starts to feel scattered, not aimless, but unfocused. And that lack of focus affects how the audience processes time within the film. Then there's the runtime. Stretching beyond 2 hours, the film demands a level of narrative efficiency that it doesn't consistently maintain. Some scenes extend beyond their emotional or narrative peak, lingering after they've already delivered their purpose. Others move too quickly, skipping over moments that needed more space to resonate. And that imbalance creates a strange duality where the film feels both drawn out and underdeveloped at the same time. It's not just about length, it's about distribution, where the time is spent, what's emphasized, what's allowed to breathe, and what's rushed past. And here, those choices don't always align with what the story needs. By the time the final act arrives, the expectation is that everything will converge, that the pacing will sharpen, that the narrative will tighten, that the accumulated tension will finally release. Instead, the film accelerates without fully stabilizing. Events unfold quickly, but without the necessary build-up to support them. And that speed doesn't create intensity, it creates compression. Key moments don't land with the weight they've been building toward because they don't have the space to unfold properly. Resolutions arrive before the emotional groundwork has been fully laid. And as a result, the climax feels less like a culmination and more like a conclusion that the film reaches rather than earns. And that's where the pacing issue becomes most apparent. Because a story about survival under constant threat should feel like it's always moving towards something inevitable, a breaking point, a final confrontation. But here, that trajectory isn't always clear. The rhythm fluctuates instead of intensifies. The ticking clock that should define the narrative never fully stabilizes. Sometimes it feels urgent, pressing forward with momentum. Other times it feels distant, almost paused. And that inconsistency disrupts the sense of danger, because urgency isn't just about speed, it's about continuity. When pacing loses that continuity, tension begins to dissolve. The stakes remain the same on paper, but the feeling of those stakes starts to fade, and what should feel like a relentless pursuit begins to feel uneven. At the center of The Running Man, 2025, there's a simple question. Why should you care if this man survives? And the film understands that question. It knows that emotional investment is the foundation of everything else. Without it, the spectacle has no anchor, so it gives Ben Richards a reason. A grounded human motivation that immediately establishes stakes beyond the game itself. He's not just fighting for survival, he's fighting for someone else. And that distinction is crucial because it shifts the narrative from external conflict to internal drive. It creates a reason to endure, a reason to keep moving even when escape seems impossible. And when the film focuses on that aspect, when it connects his actions to that underlying motivation, it becomes more effective. You understand the weight behind his choices. You see the pressure shaping his decisions. The desperation feels earned, but the challenge comes in maintaining that connection consistently. Because the character doesn't always feel anchored to that core motivation. His behavior shifts in ways that don't always feel like natural extensions of the same person. Instead of evolving, he sometimes feels like he's being repositioned to fit the needs of the scene. That creates a subtle disconnect, not enough to break the character completely, but enough to weaken the emotional through line. Because consistency is what allows an audience to fully invest. It creates trust. And when that consistency wavers, that trust starts to erode. The duality in his characterization between vulnerability and aggression has potential. It could have created a layered, complex portrait of someone under extreme pressure. But without a clear bridge between those states, it can feel less like complexity and more like instability. And that instability affects how you respond to him. You're not always sure which version of him you're watching, and that uncertainty creates distance. That distance extends into the emotional stakes. Because while the situation itself is high risk, the emotional connection doesn't always match that intensity. You understand what's at stake, but you don't always feel it escalating alongside the action. Part of that comes from the way relationships are handled. Supporting characters enter the narrative with purpose. They offer assistance, perspective, resistance, but they rarely stay long enough to fully develop those dynamics. They serve the moment, then disappear before they can leave a lasting impression. And without those sustained connections, the emotional world of the film starts to feel thin, not empty, but underdeveloped. The interactions don't build on each other. They don't accumulate into something deeper. Even the central motivation, his family, while clearly established, isn't consistently reinforced as the story progresses. It exists as a foundation, but it doesn't always remain present as a driving force. And over time, that absence becomes noticeable. Because in a narrative like this, emotional stakes need reinforcement. They need to evolve alongside the physical stakes. They need to remind you why the journey matters. The film presents both external and internal stakes. It shows you the danger, the system, the consequences. It gives you the reason, the emotion, the personal cost, but it doesn't always bind those elements together in a way that feels inseparable. And that's why, even in moments that should feel overwhelming, something feels slightly out of reach. Not missing entirely, but not fully realized either. Because the difference between watching someone survive and feeling why they need to survive is everything. And while The Running Man 2025 gets close to that connection, it never quite holds on to it long enough to make it unforgettable. A film like The Running Man lives or dies on one thing: the people inside it. Because no matter how expansive the world becomes, no matter how intense the concept is, the audience always anchors itself to faces, to voices, to performances that give that world meaning. And that's where the film places a lot of its weight, on its cast, on their ability to carry not just the story, but the emotional reality behind it. And that brings us to the center of it all: Glen Powell as Ben Richards. This is his test. Not a supporting role, not a side character. This is the kind of role that defines how an audience sees you going forward, and you can feel that weight in the way he approaches it. There's a clear effort to embody the physical toll of the journey, and in certain moments, that effort translates effectively. His body language starts to shift as the film progresses, less controlled, more reactive. There's a visible fatigue that sets in, a sense that the character is being worn down not just physically, but mentally. In those moments, the performance connects. It feels lived in. You're not just watching someone act exhausted, you're watching someone who seems like they've been running for too long without rest. And that's where he's at his strongest, when the performance becomes less about projecting intensity and more about surrendering to the situation. But then the performance shifts, and not always in a way that feels organic. There are stretches where the delivery becomes more deliberate, more heightened, as if the performance is trying to match the scale of the film rather than staying grounded within it. And that's where the cracks start to show. Because instead of feeling like a natural progression of the character, it can feel like an adjustment in approach. The role demands a kind of quiet authority, something that doesn't need to be announced, something that simply exists. And Powell doesn't always settle into that space. There are moments where the intensity feels earned, where it builds from within the character. But there are also moments where it feels applied, like an external layer rather than an internal state. And that inconsistency becomes noticeable, especially in a film that relies so heavily on one central performance. It's not about capability, it's about control, about knowing when to hold back, when to let a moment breathe, when to trust stillness over expression. And here the balance isn't always maintained. Sometimes the performance feels grounded, other times it feels like it's reaching. And that's what makes it divisive, because you can see the intention behind it, you can see what he's aiming for. The struggle, the desperation, the transformation. But the execution doesn't always land with the same clarity. It fluctuates. And in a role this central, even small inconsistencies become magnified. Now look at the supporting cast. This is where the film starts to find a different kind of energy, one that feels more defined, more confident in its identity. Because in many ways, these performances aren't trying to carry the entire film, they're enhancing it. And that allows them to be more distinct. Colman Domingo steps in and immediately shifts the dynamic. There's a precision to his performance, a clear understanding of how to navigate the film's tonal complexity. He doesn't resist the theatrical elements. He embraces them, shapes them, uses them to his advantage. There's a rhythm to his delivery, a confidence in how he occupies the screen. And because of that, every scene he's in feels more focused. He brings a sense of unpredictability, but not in a chaotic way, in a controlled, intentional way. You're not just watching a character, you're watching someone who understands the performance within the world of the film. And that awareness adds a layer of engagement that the film sometimes lacks elsewhere. Then there's Josh Brolin, and what he brings is presence, a grounded, commanding energy that naturally fits the role of someone in control. There's restraint in his performance, a deliberate stillness that contrasts with the chaos surrounding him, and that contrast works. It gives his character a sense of authority without needing to overstate it. But the limitation isn't in the performance, it's in the material. The character doesn't evolve enough to fully capitalize on what Brolin brings to it. He establishes a strong foundation, but the film doesn't build on it. So instead of becoming a central force, he remains a consistent but underutilized presence, effective in the moment, but not fully realized over time. And then there's Michael Cera. And his presence shifts the tone in a way that shouldn't work, but somehow does. There's an unpredictability to his performance that feels disconnected from the rest of the film, yet oddly complementary to its underlying chaos. He doesn't fit neatly into the established tone, and that's exactly why he stands out. There's a looseness to his approach, a willingness to lean into awkwardness, to let moments feel offbeat rather than controlled. And in doing so, he introduces a kind of energy that the film doesn't consistently allow itself to explore. It feels risky, different, and for brief stretches, it opens up a version of the film that feels more alive, more willing to experiment. And that raises a larger question about the film's overall approach, because these supporting performances hint at a range of tones and styles that the film touches on, but never fully commits to. You see glimpses of what could have been if those elements were pushed further, integrated more deeply into the narrative. The rest of the cast, there's no shortage of talent, but talent alone isn't enough. It needs space. It needs development. And here, many of these characters function more as narrative tools than as fully realized individuals. They appear with purpose, they contribute to the moment, and then they're gone. And because of that, their impact is limited. Not because the performances aren't effective, but because they don't have the time to resonate. They don't linger. They don't evolve. They don't leave a lasting impression beyond their immediate role in the story. So instead of building a network of strong, interconnected characters, the film creates a series of brief interactions. Moments that work in isolation, but don't accumulate into something deeper. And that affects the overall emotional texture of the film. It feels populated, but not fully inhabited. And when you step back and look at the whole picture, the performances reflect the film itself. There's effort, there's talent. There are flashes of something compelling, something memorable, but those elements don't always align. They don't always reinforce each other in a way that creates cohesion. Because in a story like this, you don't just need actors. You need presence, you need performances that define the world, that anchor the chaos, that give the audience something to hold on to. And The Running Man, 2025, it offers glimpses of that, moments where everything feels aligned, but not enough consistency to make those moments define the experience. If there's one thing The Running Man absolutely has to get right, it's this, the chase, because at its core this isn't just about action, it's about pursuit, about pressure that never lets up, about a constant sense that danger is always one step behind. And the film understands that on a conceptual level. It delivers movement, scale, variety. There's no shortage of sequences designed to keep the energy high. But action at its most effective isn't just about what's happening, it's about what could happen. It's about anticipation, about uncertainty, about the feeling that something could go wrong at any second. And that's where the film starts to lose its edge. Because while the action is technically solid, well-framed, clearly staged, it doesn't always carry that underlying tension. It's structured, but not always suspenseful. You can follow it, but you're not always pulled into it. There are moments where that changes. Early sequences where everything feels unstable, where the environment becomes unpredictable, where the character feels exposed rather than protected. And in those moments, the film taps into something more effective. You feel the lack of control. You feel the immediacy of the danger. The bridge sequence is another example, where the scale, the stakes, and the execution briefly align. It creates a sense of vulnerability, of risk that feels immediate rather than distant. And for those moments, the film feels fully engaged with its own premise. But those sequences exist more as highlights than as a consistent standard. Because the majority of the action operates within a safer framework, it follows expected patterns. It delivers what's required, but rarely pushes beyond that, and a big part of that comes down to escalation. In a story built around survival, each encounter should build on the last. The pressure should compound, the difficulty should increase, but here, that progression isn't always clear. The film moves from one set piece to another without consistently raising the stakes in a meaningful way, so instead of tension building, it resets. Each sequence starts fresh, rather than carrying forward the weight of what came before. And once that pattern becomes visible, the sense of danger starts to diminish, because the audience begins to understand the rhythm, and with that understanding comes predictability. You never fully feel like the character is on the edge of failure. Because the film doesn't push him far enough into that space. The system is present, the threat is established, but it doesn't close in with enough intensity to feel unavoidable. And that's where the absence of a strong opposing force becomes noticeable. The hunters exist, but they don't feel persistent. They don't feel like a constant presence shaping the journey, and without that, the pursuit lacks a personal dimension. It becomes functional rather than obsessive, because the most effective chase narratives aren't just about being followed, they're about being targeted, about a connection between hunter and hunted that builds over time. And that connection never fully solidifies here, so the action remains external, rather than becoming something that feels psychologically driven. Even the more creative elements, traps, environments, shifting locations, hint at a deeper potential that isn't fully explored. The ideas are there, but they aren't pushed to their limits. They introduce variation, but not transformation. And again, tone plays a role, because when the film shifts its identity, it affects how the action is perceived. Moments that should feel intense are softened. Moments that could build tension are interrupted. And that inconsistency prevents the action from fully locking into a sustained rhythm. So what you end up with is action that functions but doesn't define. It delivers movement, spectacle, engagement, but not memorability. Not the kind of sequence that lingers. That becomes synonymous with the film itself. Because a story like this needs a moment that encapsulates everything it's trying to do. One sequence that captures the tension, the scale, the emotion, the identity. And while the film gets close, it never quite reaches that point. It runs, it moves, it entertains, but it never fully creates that sense of being hunted. That feeling that the danger isn't just on screen, but closing in. If The Running Man 2025 doesn't always win you over with its story, it definitely tries to do it with its look. Because visually, this film has a clear sense of design, not just in aesthetics, but in intention. It understands that the world itself is part of the narrative. There's a deliberate contrast between environments. The broadcast world feels controlled, almost sterile. Everything is framed with precision. The lighting is clean, the compositions are balanced, the surfaces feel untouched. It's a version of reality that's been curated, refined, presented for consumption. Step outside of that, and the visual language shifts. The world becomes textured, uneven, unpredictable. The lighting is harsher, the spaces feel lived in, the environment carries weight. And that contrast does more than just create visual variety. It reinforces the central idea of illusion versus reality. Because what the audience sees isn't the full picture, and the cinematography reflects that divide. There's a physicality to the camera that keeps you close to the action. It doesn't just observe, it follows. It reacts. It places you within the movement rather than outside of it. And that approach adds immediacy to certain sequences, making them feel more immersive, more grounded in the character's perspective. But even here, consistency becomes a factor. Because while the visual style is clearly defined, it doesn't always maintain the same level of impact across the entire film. Some moments feel fully realized, where composition, movement, and tone align. Others feel more functional, serving the scene without elevating it, and that inconsistency mirrors the rest of the film. There's a strong foundation, a clear vision, but not always the precision needed to carry that vision through every moment. Still, when it works, when the visuals, the movement, and the tone align, you can see the film that this could have been. One where every frame reinforces the world, where every shot adds to the tension, where the environment itself becomes part of the story being told. And those moments, even if they're not constant, are enough to show that the film understands what it wants to be, even if it doesn't always get there. At times, it almost feels like you're part of the chase, running with Ben, not just watching him. And that feeling matters more than spectacle ever could, because immersion is what turns action into experience. It's what makes a sequence feel immediate instead of merely impressive. When the camera stays close, when the movement feels unbroken, when the space between one decision and the next becomes razor-thin, the film briefly finds a physical language that matches its premise. You don't feel like an observer standing at a comfortable distance. You feel pulled into the instability of it, into the panic, into the split-second choices, and in those moments, the movie starts to tap into something much stronger than style for style's sake. It starts to create momentum you can actually feel, and when the film leans into longer takes, it works, not just because they look technically impressive, but because they preserve tension. They deny the audience the relief that cutting can sometimes provide. There's no reset, no clean escape from the pressure of the moment. The movement keeps flowing, the danger keeps advancing, and the scene is forced to sustain itself in real time. That kind of continuity gives the action a nervous energy. It makes the chaos feel less choreographed and more immediate. It lets the environment, the performance, and the staging do the work together. And for a film built around pursuit, that choice makes sense. It creates the illusion that the world is closing in without pause. But here's where things get interesting. Because for a film directed by Edgar Wright, you expect something more. Not just competence, not just clarity. You expect authorship. You expect the kind of formal confidence that leaves fingerprints on every frame. Edgar Wright is the kind of filmmaker whose style usually doesn't just support a scene, it defines how the scene breathes. His editing often functions like a second score, turning transitions, reactions, and even tiny gestures into part of the rhythm. So when a film like this arrives and feels comparatively restrained, that absence becomes part of the conversation. You expect style that's unmistakable, editing that's sharp, rhythmic, almost musical, that signature energy, the kind of precision where cuts don't just move information forward, they create propulsion. They create attitude, they create impact. And while there are glimpses of that sensibility here, they never become the dominant language of the film. You catch flashes of that instinct, brief reminders of what this material could have become in more formally aggressive hands. But the movie rarely stays in that mode long enough for it to define the experience. The editing here is surprisingly restrained, and that restraint isn't inherently wrong. In fact, there are cases where it helps. It keeps certain sequences clear. It prevents the action from becoming incomprehensible. It allows the performances and environments room to exist without being chopped into pure sensation. But for this specific story, for this premise, this director, this world, that restraint also feels like a missed chance. Because a film about surveillance, spectacle, media manipulation, and human beings turned into entertainment seems almost built for editorial invention. Built for visual rhythm, built for transitions that feel weaponized. It's clean, it's competent, but it's not bold. And that distinction becomes crucial the longer the film goes on. Because competence can carry a scene, but boldness is what gives a film identity. Boldness is what makes a sequence feel authored instead of merely assembled. Here, you don't get enough of those rapid transitions, those playful or aggressive visual bridges, those cuts that create meaning through juxtaposition. You don't get enough moments where the film seems intoxicated by its own formal possibilities. Instead, it plays it safe. And for a director whose name is usually associated with energy, precision, and invention, that safety becomes one of the film's most unexpected qualities. And that's the biggest surprise, because this story feels like it was built for a more aggressive visual style, something faster, sharper, more inventive, not necessarily more chaotic but more expressive, more willing to let the mechanics of filmmaking become part of the storytelling. A movie about a mediated reality, about a man whose suffering is turned into public spectacle, practically invites a visual language that feels manipulated, curated, relentless. A language that mirrors the system inside the story, but the film holds back, and because it holds back, it creates a strange disconnect. Because visually it looks good, but it doesn't always feel distinct. It has craft without always reaching transformation. It has polish without always achieving personality. Then there's the production design, and this is where the film really starts asserting itself with more confidence. Because whatever hesitation exists in the editing, the world building itself often feels carefully considered. The environments don't just function as backdrops, they communicate ideology. They reflect a society that has fused technology, entertainment, and control into one seamless system. You can sense the rules of the world not because characters constantly explain them, but because the spaces themselves feel shaped by those rules. The world feels lived in, and that's crucial because dystopian settings can often become too schematic, too clean in their symbolism, too obviously designed to make a point. Here, there's enough texture, enough environmental storytelling to make the setting feel inhabited rather than merely conceptual. From the surveillance drones floating through the air to the screens constantly broadcasting, to the environments shaped by control and fear, everything reinforces the idea that this society is always watching, always recording, always turning life into content. And what makes that design effective is that it doesn't feel decorative, it feels systemic. These aren't just futuristic props placed around the frame to signal genre. They feel like natural extensions of how this society operates. Even the small details matter. And often, those small details are what make the world more convincing than the larger visual gestures. A poster peeling off a wall can say as much about public decay as an entire exposition scene. A camera hovering just a little too close can create unease more efficiently than dialogue ever could. A space that feels public but not safe tells you everything about the relationship between visibility and vulnerability in this world. These touches add depth. They suggest history. They imply systems of maintenance, neglect, fear, and control without stopping the film to explain any of it. And that kind of design intelligence goes a long way. They make the world believable, and that's crucial. Because if the world doesn't feel real, the stakes don't either. In a story this dependent on atmosphere, the environment has to do more than look interesting. It has to feel like something that could pressure the characters, shape their behavior, and limit their freedom. The best production design doesn't just decorate the story, it traps the characters inside it. And when The Running Man, 2025, is working on that level, you can feel how the architecture of the world itself becomes part of the threat. Not just the people chasing Ben, not just the broadcast around him. The entire social environment feels built to expose, contain, and exploit. The film also plays with aesthetics in interesting ways. There's a clear attempt to create a visual identity that isn't purely futuristic in the sleek, anonymous sense. Instead, it folds in textures and references that give the world a strange temporal ambiguity. It doesn't feel entirely like tomorrow. It feels like a future built out of leftovers from older media cultures, older fantasies of television, older forms of spectacle that have been updated rather than replaced. That's an intriguing idea because it suggests continuity between past and present forms of manipulation. The technology evolves, but the impulse behind it remains the same. There's this mix of modern technology and retro influence, neon elements, broadcast visuals, a slight throwback feel, blended with current ideas of surveillance and media, and conceptually, that's rich territory. It allows the film to connect old-fashioned showmanship with contemporary mechanisms of control. It suggests that the culture of spectacle never disappeared, it just changed platforms. Sometimes it works beautifully. In those moments, the world feels stylized in a way that supports the themes. The visual throwback quality doesn't feel nostalgic, it feels sinister, like old entertainment logic repurposed for something colder and more invasive. Other times, it feels a bit confused, like it's not fully committing to one visual identity, and that hesitation echoes some of the film's tonal uncertainty. You can see multiple impulses competing inside the design. One part of the film wants harsh realism, another wants stylized media satire, another wants retro-futurist iconography. None of those impulses are bad on their own, but they aren't always integrated into one cohesive visual philosophy. So instead of a singular identity, you sometimes get a collage of good ideas that don't entirely fuse. But even then, the effort is clear. This is not a film that treats its world casually. It cares about visual texture. It cares about environmental detail. It cares about the difference between a setting that merely contains action and one that shapes the emotional response to that action. This is a film that cares about how its world looks, about how it feels, about how it immerses you. And that effort matters because even when the results are uneven, you can sense the intention behind them. And when everything aligns, the visuals elevate the experience. They give the film a seriousness, a density, a tactile quality that the script and pacing don't always maintain on their own. They help sell the oppression of the system. They help externalize the film's anxieties. They make the world feel oppressive not just because characters say it is, but because every frame seems built to remind you that someone is watching, someone is framing, someone is profiting. But when it doesn't, you're left with something that's polished, but not unforgettable. Because that's the difference. It's not about whether a film looks good. Plenty of films look good. The real question is whether the visual language becomes inseparable from the film itself, whether you can identify its world instantly, whether its imagery lingers independent of plot, whether the design crosses the line from effective to iconic. And The Running Man, 2025, it gets close. It builds a strong world. It creates atmosphere. It understands texture, control, and visual contrast. But it stops just short of becoming visually iconic. It doesn't fully transform its ideas into a singular cinematic signature. And in a story this big, that final step matters. Because when you're telling a story about spectacle, the film itself has to be willing to become one. Now here's where The Running Man, 2025, becomes unpredictable. Because this isn't just a dark dystopian story. It's also trying to be funny, and not just funny in the broad, crowd-pleasing sense. It's reaching for something more uncomfortable. humor that exposes absurdity rather than relieves it. Humor that makes brutality feel even more grotesque because it recognizes the sick joke embedded inside the world itself. That instinct makes sense. In fact, a story like this almost requires it, because the premise is already laced with irony. A civilization so morally hollow that it can turn desperation into mass entertainment is horrifying, yes, but it's also inherently absurd. And great satire understands that horror and absurdity are often inseparable. On paper, that's perfect. A world this brutal, this absurd, this controlled should have humor baked into it, because the situation itself is insane. People being hunted for entertainment, that's already satire. That's already darkly ironic. The very structure of the world contains its own joke, and that joke is poison. It tells you that the system has become so distorted that the lines between suffering, consumption, and amusement have collapsed. So the film has every reason to lean into that. And whenever it does, even briefly, the movie becomes more interesting. Sometimes it does. There are moments where the humor hits, quick lines, unexpected reactions, absurd situations that feel just twisted enough to work. And those moments matter because they reveal a sharper version of the film hiding underneath the more cautious one. A version that understands how to weaponize tonal discomfort. A version that sees how laughter can become part of the critique. When the film lands one of those beats, it suddenly feels less generic, less restrained, more aware of the bizarre cruelty of its own premise. You get flashes of something sharp, something that understands the ridiculousness of the world. And in those moments, the film feels alive, not lighter necessarily, just more confident, more willing to treat the world not only as a nightmare, but as a grotesque performance. And that distinction is important because satire doesn't weaken dystopia, it often deepens it. It reveals how systems of power can become theatrical, self-justifying, and absurd while still remaining lethal. But here's the issue. It doesn't happen consistently. The humor feels scattered, like it appears, disappears, then reappears again. And because of that, it never becomes part of the film's identity. It just feels like something that shows up occasionally. A seasoning rather than a governing tone. And that inconsistency matters, because comedy in a film like this isn't just an accessory. It has to be integrated into the worldview of the movie. It has to feel like the same intelligence shaping the violence, the dialogue, the performances, and the visual language. When it's merely intermittent, it doesn't sharpen the film, it fragments it. Take characters like Michael Cera's. He brings a completely different energy. Weird, awkward, unexpected, and suddenly the film feels more interesting, more unstable in a good way, more willing to let eccentricity interrupt the expected rhythm. His presence suggests a film that might have embraced stranger tonal choices, a film less afraid of letting awkwardness, irony, and oddball energy sit next to brutality. And because of that, he doesn't just stand out as a performer, he exposes an alternate version of the movie that might have been more distinctive, more willing to take risks. But then, that energy fades, and you're back to a more serious tone. And that shift, it's noticeable, not because seriousness is the wrong choice, but because the contrast feels unintegrated. The humor doesn't seem to emerge naturally from the same tonal engine as the darkness. It feels like a temporary detour, a side door opening and closing. So instead of enriching the atmosphere, it can make the film feel undecided about how much absurdity it truly wants to own. Because the film never fully commits to being funny, it flirts with humor, but doesn't embrace it. And that affects the dialogue too, because dialogue is where satire often reveals whether a film is actually willing to bite. There are lines that work, moments where the writing feels clever, or self-aware, or just genuinely entertaining. Lines that briefly cut through the heaviness and remind you that someone behind the film understands the lunacy of the setup. But there are just as many moments where the dialogue feels flat, over-explained, overwritten, or just not sharp enough. It states its meaning rather than slicing into it, especially for a film that's trying to balance satire. Because satire needs precision, it needs bite, it needs lines that don't simply describe corruption but expose it. Lines that reveal hypocrisy in a single turn of phrase, lines that sound effortless but land like a blade. And here, the film often circles its ideas, instead of cutting into them. You can sense the themes moving underneath the dialogue, but too often the writing presents them in a way that feels softened, cautious, or too literal. The point arrives, but the sting does not. Even the darker humor, the kind that should feel uncomfortable, doesn't always go far enough. It pulls back, it softens the edge, and when that happens, the impact disappears. Because dark comedy only really works when the film trusts the discomfort it creates, when it's willing to let the audience laugh and then feel implicated in that laughter, when it understands that unease is the point. But here, the movie often seems hesitant to fully weaponize that tension. It wants the advantages of satire without always accepting the severity of its sharpest form. Because in a world this extreme, you need boldness. You need dialogue that matches the intensity of the concept. You need humor that feels intentional, not accidental. Humor that clarifies the moral ugliness of the world by revealing how ridiculous its logic has become. And that's what's missing: consistency. Not the complete absence of wit, but the absence of a stable comic intelligence running through the entire film. Because the film clearly has the ability. It shows it in moments, but it never builds on it. It never lets those moments accumulate into a full tonal signature. So instead of a film defined by sharp wit or dark comedy, you get something in between. A few laughs, a few clever moments, but nothing that truly defines the experience. And that matters because in a premise this absurd, humor shouldn't feel optional. It should feel embedded in the architecture of the story. It should reveal the madness of the system more ruthlessly than exposition ever could. And in a story built on absurdity and violence, that's a missed opportunity. Because sometimes, the darkest worlds produce the sharpest humor. Not in spite of their cruelty, but because of it. Because satire sees that power often behaves like a performance, and performance is always vulnerable to ridicule, but only if you're willing to go all the way. And The Running Man 2025, it stops just short. Beneath all the running, all the violence, all the spectacle, The Running Man 2025 is trying to say something. And whatever frustrations the film has in tone or pacing, its thematic concerns are not difficult to identify. This isn't just a story about survival. It's a story about control. Control over information. Control over perception. Control over people. It wants to frame the chase not only as physical persecution, but as ideological domination. A system doesn't just need to capture the body. It needs to control the story around the body. It needs to decide what everyone else sees, believes, and repeats. From the very beginning, the film makes it clear, this world isn't broken by accident, it's designed. And that distinction is important, because it shifts the film away from generic dystopian collapse and into something more pointed. This is not chaos resulting from neglect. It is order constructed for advantage. A system where corporations don't just sell products, they shape reality. Where media doesn't just report the truth, it decides what the truth is. And that idea gives the film its strongest thematic spine. The problem isn't simply corruption, it's narrative monopoly, the ability of institutions to define reality so completely that resistance starts to look like deviance. And that's where the film's strongest idea lies: perception is power. Not force alone, not surveillance alone, but the power to determine which version of events becomes socially accepted. Because in this world, what people believe matters more than what's real. That's a chilling concept, and one the film understands intuitively even when it doesn't explore it with maximum sharpness. Truth here is not discovered through evidence. It's distributed through authority, manufactured through repetition. Packaged for emotional effect, a man isn't just hunted, he's branded. That word matters. He isn't merely pursued as an individual threat. He is narratively processed, converted into an image, a category, a story the public can consume. A story isn't just told, it's engineered, adjusted, shaped, optimized for public reaction. And the audience, they're not just watching, they're participating, they're part of the system, and that may be the film's most unsettling observation. Because it doesn't present oppression as something maintained only from above. It presents it as something sustained laterally, through mass participation, through citizens who accept their role as extensions of the machine. They report sightings. They follow narratives. They react exactly the way they're meant to. And that's where the film becomes more than a chase story. It becomes a portrait of social conditioning, of a public trained not merely to consume spectacle, but to help produce it. That idea lands because it implicates more than the villains in suits or the architects of the show. It implicates the infrastructure of attention itself, the hunger to watch, the reflex to judge, the willingness to accept a mediated version of reality as sufficient. And that's where the film hits closest to home, because it doesn't feel like science fiction. It feels like a slight exaggeration of reality. Not a wild leap, but an extension. A society in which outrage is monetized, narratives are weaponized, and visibility can be both seductive and fatal. The idea that media can manipulate emotion, that corporations can shape public opinion, that outrage can be turned into entertainment, that's not new. What the film does is intensify those tendencies until they become explicit instruments of social control. But the film pushes it further. It shows a world where suffering becomes content, where violence becomes spectacle, where human lives are reduced to ratings. And that reduction is the real horror underneath the premise. Not just that people die, but that death itself has been absorbed into the economy of attention. Value is measured through visibility. Humanity is flattened into engagement. A person is no longer a person once the system successfully repackages them as a narrative object, and it asks a dangerous question. At what point do we stop being viewers and start being part of the problem? That's the question hanging underneath the action, and it's the question that gives the film whatever lasting weight it has. Because it refuses to isolate guilt entirely within the official machinery of oppression. It suggests that systems like this survive because they cultivate appetite. They train the public to enjoy, rationalize, and even assist the very thing that dehumanizes others. That's why the theme works even when the film's execution wavers, because the central fear is recognizable. Not just the fear of being watched, but the fear of being interpreted for mass consumption by institutions that profit from distortion. The fear that truth can be outperformed by spectacle, that pain can be reformatted into entertainment, that once a system controls the frame, reality itself becomes negotiable. And in that sense, the film's thematic core is stronger than some of its dramatic choices. It understands the modern anxiety it wants to tap into. The anxiety that power no longer needs to hide its manipulation, as long as it can make manipulation pleasurable, convenient, and emotionally satisfying to the public. That is the world The Running Man, 2025, is trying to expose. A world where control works best when people mistake participation for freedom. And when the film locks into that idea, even briefly, you can see the sharper, more dangerous movie hiding inside it. A movie less interested in merely staging a chase than in showing how the entire culture has been organized around turning human desperation into consumable reality. There's also a strong theme of class division. And it's not just present in the background, it's embedded into the structure of the world itself. You can feel it in how the film frames space, access, and power. The gap between the powerful and the powerless isn't just economic, it's systemic. It defines who gets to control the narrative, who gets to exist comfortably within the system, and who gets pushed into becoming part of the spectacle. The elite control everything: the system, the media, the rules. But more importantly, they control the conditions under which everyone else makes choices. That's what makes the imbalance feel so heavy. It's not just about having more. It's about shaping the environment so completely that those without power are left with no real alternatives. And the film subtly reinforces that idea through the way opportunities are presented. They're never truly opportunities. They're ultimatums disguised as chances. And the rest, they're left to survive within it or become part of it. And that "or" is what defines The World, because it suggests that participation isn't optional, it's inevitable. You either navigate the system on its terms or you're consumed by it. There's no neutral ground, no safe distance. Everyone is positioned somewhere within its machinery. Ben Richards isn't just fighting for his life, he's fighting against a system that was never meant to let him win. And that idea gives the story a kind of underlying tension that goes beyond the physical chase. Because even when he escapes danger, even when he survives a moment, the system itself remains intact. It doesn't bend, it doesn't break, it simply adapts. And that creates a different kind of pressure, one that isn't tied to a single threat, but to the structure of the world itself. And that's what gives the story weight, because it's not just about escaping death, it's about challenging something much bigger, a machine that feeds on desperation, a system that benefits from suffering, and the film understands that conceptually. It presents a world where inequality isn't just a condition, it's a resource, something that can be exploited, monetized, and sustained. But here's where the film starts to hold itself back. Because while it introduces these ideas clearly, it doesn't always deepen them. It establishes the imbalance, it shows the consequences, but it doesn't always explore the mechanisms behind it in a way that feels layered or evolving. You see the structure, but you don't always see how it operates beneath the surface. And yet, for all its ideas, the film doesn't always push them far enough. It shows you the problem, it highlights the system, it makes the message clear. But clarity alone isn't enough to create impact, because when a film leans too heavily on stating its themes, it risks flattening them. It turns something that could feel immersive into something that feels instructional. Sometimes it explains too much, and in doing so, it removes the space for the audience to engage with the ideas on their own terms. It replaces discovery with confirmation. You're not uncovering the system, you're being told how it works. And that reduces the emotional weight of it. Sometimes it repeats itself, not in a literal sense, but in how it reinforces the same point without adding new dimensions to it. The idea stays the same, the presentation shifts slightly, but the impact doesn't deepen. It remains consistent, but not progressive, and sometimes it just presents the idea without fully exploring it. It introduces a concept, lets it exist for a moment, and then moves on before it can fully resonate, and that creates a sense of incompleteness. not because the idea isn't strong, but because it isn't given the space to evolve. So instead of feeling sharp and cutting, the commentary can feel a bit obvious, like it's pointing at the issue instead of making you feel it, and that distinction matters more than anything else. Because effective social commentary isn't about recognition, it's about experience. It's about creating a reaction that lingers beyond the scene, because the best social commentary doesn't just tell you what's wrong, it puts you inside it. It makes you feel complicit. It creates discomfort not through explanation, but through immersion. It forces you to confront the system from within, rather than observing it from a distance. The Running Man 2025 gets close. It builds the world, it sets up the ideas, it makes the connections clear, but it doesn't always deliver that final impact, the moment where the idea stops being conceptual and becomes personal. Still, the intention is there. The relevance is there, and in certain moments, when the film aligns its themes with its execution, you can feel the weight of what it's trying to say. You can feel how the system operates not just as a backdrop, but as a force shaping every decision, every outcome. And in those moments, the film reminds you just how thin the line is between fiction and reality. Because in a world driven by attention, where truth can be shaped and people become content, the distance between exaggeration and reflection becomes harder to define. You start to recognize patterns, familiar behaviors, systems that don't feel entirely fictional, and that's where the film's relevance begins to land more effectively, not as a statement, but as a question. Are we really that far away from this? Now let's talk about the part of The Running Man 2025 that quietly chips away at everything else, the writing. Because this is where all the ideas, all the performances, all the visual elements either come together or start to unravel. Because here's the thing, a movie like this doesn't need perfect realism. It doesn't need to justify every exaggerated element or ground every concept in strict logic. It's operating in a heightened space, and the audience is willing to accept that. But what it does need is internal consistency, a sense that the world operates by its own rules, and that those rules don't shift depending on what the story needs in the moment. And that's where the cracks start to show, not all at once, but gradually. Small moments where logic feels flexible, where outcomes feel slightly too convenient, and once that pattern begins to emerge, it changes how you engage with the story. Throughout the film, there are moments where you stop and think, wait, how does that work? And that question doesn't just interrupt the scene, it creates distance. Because instead of being immersed, you're analyzing. Instead of feeling tension, you're questioning structure. Characters make choices that don't fully add up, not in a way that reflects complexity, but in a way that feels shaped by necessity. Situations resolve a little too cleanly. Problems appear, escalate, and then dissolve without the kind of resistance that would make them feel earned. Danger appears and disappears, depending on what the scene needs, and that inconsistency affects the stakes. Because if the threat isn't stable, if it can intensify or fade without a clear reason, then it stops feeling real. It starts feeling controlled by the narrative rather than emerging from it, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. It becomes part of how you process every sequence. You start anticipating the convenience. You start expecting the resolution. Take the idea of survival. This is supposed to be a deadly game, a system designed to eliminate contestants, but somehow Ben Richards keeps slipping through, again and again and again. And the issue isn't that he survives, it's how he survives. Because the film doesn't always establish the cause behind that survival in a convincing way. Not always because he outsmarts the system, but because the story needs him to survive. And that difference is everything. Because when survival is tied to intelligence, adaptability, or sacrifice, it builds tension. It makes each escape feel earned. But when it feels like an obligation of the narrative, it weakens that tension. Then there are the hunters. On paper, they should be terrifying. Not just because of their skill, but because of their persistence. They should feel like a constant pressure, something that shapes every decision the protagonist makes, but in execution. They often feel inconsistent, their presence fluctuates, their effectiveness varies. Sometimes they're precise, calculated, dangerous. Other times, they miss opportunities that feel too obvious to ignore. And that inconsistency doesn't just affect their credibility, it affects the entire structure of the chase. Because if the threat isn't reliable, the stakes aren't either. The audience needs to believe that the danger is always there, always closing in. And when that belief weakens, so does the tension. Then you have the world itself. The film introduces some interesting ideas, technology, surveillance, media manipulation, but doesn't always define how they operate within the story. Or worse, it introduces elements that raise more questions than answers, without providing enough context to ground them. Certain sequences feel disconnected. Characters appear without clear setup. Important developments happen without enough buildup, and instead of expanding the world, those moments create fragmentation. There's also a reliance on coincidence. Events align too neatly, timing feels too precise. People arrive exactly when needed, without the groundwork that would make their presence feel organic. And while occasional coincidence is part of storytelling, when it becomes a pattern, it starts to feel like a shortcut. Like the story is moving itself forward rather than being driven by its own internal logic. Even the structure contributes to this. Because the film moves quickly between events, it doesn't always allow those events to fully establish themselves. It prioritizes forward motion over clarity, and that creates a kind of narrative blur. You're keeping up with what's happening, but not always understanding how or why it's happening. And then we reach the final act. This is where everything should come together, where the logic solidifies, where the setups pay off, where the story finds its resolution through the rules it's established. But instead, this is where the writing struggles the most. The pacing accelerates, but the clarity doesn't follow. Key developments feel compressed. Certain choices feel more like necessities than conclusions, and the resolution leans on ideas that haven't been fully developed throughout the film. It feels less like a natural conclusion and more like a patch, something applied to close the story, rather than something that emerges from it. And that's the biggest issue, because when the writing isn't solid, everything else starts to weaken. The action loses its edge, the characters lose their grounding, the world loses its credibility. You're no longer inside the story, you're watching it from the outside and asking questions, not about the themes, but about the structure. Because at the end of the day, a film like this doesn't fail because of its ideas. It fails because of how those ideas are executed. And The Running Man 2025, it has strong concepts, it has potential. But the writing doesn't always hold it together. There's something you feel in a movie like The Running Man before you even realize it's happening, the pulse. Not something you consciously track, but something your body responds to. The rhythm beneath the visuals, the layer that carries emotion when everything else is in motion. Not the visuals, not the dialogue, the energy, the thing that keeps your heart rate just a little higher, that makes a chase feel urgent, that turns a moment into an experience. And that's where the film's sound and music come in, because when other elements start to lose consistency, this is one area that continues to provide structure. It doesn't fix everything, but it supports the film in ways that aren't always immediately visible. The score has a very specific identity. It blends modern intensity with a slightly retro edge, almost like it's echoing the past while trying to stay grounded in the present, and that duality fits the film's overall approach. It doesn't fully commit to one tonal direction, but in the case of the music, that blend feels more intentional than uncertain, and when it hits, you feel it, not just as background, but as propulsion. It drives the momentum. It reinforces the pacing when the editing doesn't. It fills the silence between moments with tension that the narrative sometimes struggles to maintain on its own. You're not just watching the chase, you're hearing it. The rhythm of movement, the escalation of danger, the shift from control to chaos, it all comes through in the way the sound is layered. And that matters, because in a film built around movement, sound becomes part of the storytelling. It becomes a guide for how you process intensity. There are moments where the audio design really stands out, not in an obvious, attention-grabbing way, but in how it shapes the atmosphere. Crowd noise swelling like a wave, reminding you that this isn't just survival, it's entertainment. That presence of the audience, even when unseen, adds a layer of pressure that extends beyond the immediate environment. The hum of drones overhead, constant, invasive, almost mechanical, it becomes part of the world's texture, a reminder that surveillance isn't occasional, it's continuous. And because that sound never fully disappears, it creates a sense of unease that lingers even in quieter moments. The sudden drop in sound, where everything fades except footsteps, breathing, and fear. Those moments are some of the film's most effective because they strip everything down to the essentials. They remove distraction, they isolate the experience, and in doing so, they amplify the tension. Those moments work, they pull you in. They create immersion, they make the world feel alive and watching you. Even the music choices during action sequences, they don't just sit in the background, they push the scenes forward. They add urgency where the pacing might hesitate. They give the film that theatrical edge, that sense that this is meant to be experienced at full volume, with full intensity, that sense that this is meant to surround you, not just visually, but physically. And in a theater, that energy lands. You feel the impact more, the chaos, the movement, the scale. It becomes less about what's happening and more about how it feels. And that shift is important because sensation can sometimes carry a film through moments where structure starts to weaken. It creates an immediate connection, something instinctive, something that bypasses logic and goes straight to reaction. And in a film built around survival, that kind of sensory engagement becomes a tool in itself. It keeps you present. It keeps you invested, even when other elements start to drift. But here's the thing, while the sound and music support the film, they don't always elevate it to another level. They function more as reinforcement than transformation. They hold scenes together, they maintain momentum. They prevent the film from completely losing its rhythm when pacing or tone begins to slip, but they rarely redefine a moment. They rarely take something ordinary and make it unforgettable. They're effective, they do their job. They keep the film alive when it starts to slow down, but they don't always leave a lasting imprint beyond the experience itself. You won't necessarily walk out humming anything. You won't recall a specific musical identity tied to a particular moment. What stays with you is the atmosphere they create, not the individual pieces that build it, and maybe that's intentional. Maybe the goal isn't memorability in isolation, but cohesion within the experience, because The Running Man 2025 isn't always consistent in its storytelling, but it understands something important: energy matters. It understands that even when narrative clarity falters, emotional engagement can still be maintained through rhythm, through intensity, through sensory design. Even when the pacing stumbles, even when the tone shifts, even when the writing gets messy, the film still tries to keep you engaged through sensation, through sound, through rhythm, through atmosphere. And that approach doesn't solve the deeper issues, but it does soften them. It creates a through line that carries the film forward, even when other elements struggle to align. And sometimes that's enough to carry you through, not to fully satisfy, but to keep you from disconnecting entirely. Because in a story about survival, you don't just need to see the chaos, you need to feel it. You need to sense the pressure, the urgency, the instability. And for all its flaws, this is one area where the film never completely loses its pulse. It keeps beating, even when everything around it becomes uneven. Every film like The Running Man is building toward one thing: the finish line. Not just a literal ending, but a culmination. A moment where everything that's been set up, emotionally, thematically, structurally, comes together in a way that feels inevitable. Earned complete, because no matter how strong the journey is, if the destination doesn't land, it reshapes how you see everything that came before. And that's exactly where this film struggles the most. For most of its runtime, the movie is setting up something big, not just in terms of action, but in terms of meaning. A man versus the system, truth versus manipulation, survival versus control. These aren't small ideas. They carry weight. They suggest a conclusion that doesn't just resolve the plot, but reinforces the themes. You're expecting a climax that feels explosive, not just in scale, but in significance. Something that validates the buildup. Something that transforms the journey into something cohesive. But when we finally get there, it doesn't hit the way it should. And the reason isn't just pacing, it's compression. The film begins to condense ideas that needed space. It accelerates through moments that required tension. And instead of allowing the final act to expand the stakes, it simplifies them. The final act feels rushed, not in the sense that it moves quickly, but in the sense that it skips emotional steps. Decisions happen quickly, events unfold without enough buildup, and instead of tightening the tension, the film starts reducing it. It narrows the focus, but not in a way that deepens the impact. It removes complexity rather than refining it. And that creates a disconnect, because you can feel the film trying to reach its conclusion, but you don't feel the momentum carrying it there. It feels guided rather than driven. Like the story is being directed toward an endpoint, instead of naturally arriving at one. There are moments, brief moments, where it almost works, where the structure seems to align, where the tension feels like it's about to peak. You sense that the film is close to delivering something meaningful, but those moments don't hold, they don't extend, they pass before they can fully resolve, and then it keeps going, and that's where the real problem begins. Because the film seems to overshoot its strongest possible endpoint. There's a moment where everything could have landed, where the emotional and thematic threads briefly align in a way that feels complete. And instead of trusting that moment, the film extends beyond it. It adds more resolution, more explanation, more closure, and what comes after doesn't carry the same weight, so instead of reinforcing the impact, it dilutes it. It stretches the ending rather than sharpening it, and by doing that, it weakens the final impression. Because the audience has already felt the peak, they've already sensed where the story should resolve. And anything beyond that begins to feel like an add-on rather than a continuation. And by the time the credits roll, you're left with a strange feeling. Not frustration, not even disappointment, just underwhelmed. Because the film doesn't collapse, it just doesn't fully deliver on what it promised. The payoff doesn't match the setup. The system, which felt so overwhelming throughout the film, doesn't feel as dominant in its resolution. The conflict resolves, but without the sense that something fundamental has shifted. And that's where the thematic weight starts to slip. The resolution doesn't feel as meaningful as it should be. Because meaning doesn't come from resolution alone, it comes from transformation, from the sense that the journey has altered something in a lasting way. And here, that transformation isn't fully realized, and the emotional weight doesn't fully land. Not because it's absent, but because it's not given the space to resonate. It arrives too quickly, too cleanly, without the friction that would make it linger. It's not that the ending is confusing, it's that it feels too easy, too convenient, too controlled, and in a story built on chaos, on unpredictability, on a system that thrives on pressure, that ease feels out of place. Because a film like this needs a strong conclusion, not just to end the story, but to define it, to give the entire experience a sense of purpose, to leave something behind that stays with you after everything else fades. And The Running Man 2025 gets close. It builds the tension, it sets the stage, it creates the potential. But when it matters most, it doesn't fully deliver. It crosses the finish line, but without the impact of a true victory, without that final surge that makes the journey feel complete. And in a story about survival, that final step is everything. When you hear the name Edgar Wright, you expect something specific, not just quality, but identity. A director whose films aren't just well-made, they're unmistakable.